Good afternoon, everyone. It's very kind of you to come all this way for nothing. Absolutely nothing, or at best, very, very little. I jest, but actually, there is a surprising amount of research in science. I don't know if you knew this, but the New Scientist recently published a series of essays in a book, and it's all about nothing. So today we're going to look at the psychology of doing nothing, and together we're going to explore a contradiction. And the contradiction is summed up on the slide. The proverb you'll be very familiar with, he or she who hesitates is lost. But on the other hand, we're told that fools rush in. Which is it? Which is best? Or are they both true, and in what circumstances? What I'm talking about mainly is the theme of decision avoidance and what it is, why it matters, what sort of forms does avoidance take, and what we can do to protect ourselves from avoidance, and when is inaction the highest form of action. The starting point here is how we think about emotion. Now, some of you, if we didn't have any emotion, if we had people making the right decisions all the time, being reasonable, analytical and sensible, we'd have no books, we'd have no opera, no novels. We'd lead quite a poor life. We tend to think of emotion as driving us to destruction. And that was one of the themes of my last lecture. We've all seen it. Jealousy, seeking revenge, the foolish impulse, the things we shouldn't do, the biscuit, even just the biscuit we eat when we shouldn't. So we think of emotion as driving us. But it can also restrain us. And it can restrain us that, in ways, work against our long-term interests. And that's what I particularly want to explore. How emotion can put the brakes on where actually we need to accelerate. A keystone emotion is regret. Now, you've all heard the song, haven't you? No regret around, etc. Well, it's a very powerful emotion. And the way we define it, it's experiencing the emotions of the future in the present. In other words, it's a piece of counterfactual thinking, comparing what is with what might have been, and we tend to avoid decisions that we think we might regret. Anything that induces negative emotions. Now, I should just say here, if you've got no choice, there is no regret. Because you can't compare what is with what might have been. But wherever there's a choice, there is a possibility for regret. And that is the key to what often holds us back. Now, supposing you miss the plane, or you miss the train or the bus, whatever. What do you regret more? You miss it by 5 minutes, or you miss it by 35? Who'd regret 35 more than 5? Little show of hands. And who would regret missing it by 5 minutes? I'm missing it by 5 seconds, even more when they shut the train doors and it then stands for another minute and a half. Yeah. It's completely illogical in a sense, isn't it? Because you've missed the train. The train's gone. There's nothing you can do about it. Or the plane. But again, the regret of missing it by 5 minutes is much more intense, because the comparison between what is, you stuck at the airport, and what might have been up in the air and on your way is that much more acute. What forms of avoidance are there? Well, some of these overlap, and you will find as I get further into the subject, you may think, well, that's a bit like this and that's a bit like that. They're not absolute categories. But there are 7, if you like, deadly sins. One is discounting the future. Another one, which you're probably all most familiar with, is procrastination, the proverbial thief of time. Omission bias, do no harm. Delaying choice. Taking refuge in the status quo. Taking refuge in certainty. And the not believing is broken syndrome. What do they all mean? Well, here's a nice little choice for you. What would you like? £100,000 now or 120,000 in a year's time? Takes your money, takes your choice. What's it to be?
Take it now.
Take it now, wouldn't? And yet, if I can just ask you to look at the sums there, what's the more valuable option? Given rates of interest today. It's definitely, isn't it, to hang on a year and wait. But psychologists believe that we have this desire for instant gratification, even though it would pay us to wait. So we tend to discount the future. And that explains, for example, if you just remember, Castaway, you remember the referendum, Scottish independence? It's history now. But what promises the politicians made when they dashed up to Edinburgh? And now, of course, the call is deliver, a form of discounting the future. Flood defences that don't get built because it's thought, oh, well, it'll only flood in one in every 50 years. 49 years later, the defence still hasn't been built. Again, we have, as human beings, a preference for dealing with here and now, even though there are costly problems in the future that are being postponed. Procrastination. I've put the dentist there. Because how many of you think you need to go to the dentist? And you think, I'd better make an appointment. And then you think, well, okay. And it takes you a month to get round to making the appointment. And when you do, you make it as far out into the future as you can. And when it gets nearer the time, you find an excuse to ring up and postpone it. And postpone it even again. And the trouble is, of course, that if you have got some form of problem, tooth decay, whatever, it can only get worse in the intervening space. And to procrastinate is to postpone necessary but sometimes unpleasant action, knowing that time is only going to make things worse. The attraction is procrastination offers us a little bit of psychological shelter, but we pay for it at the price of deeper entanglement. I'll give you an example from my research. I've talked to a number of owners of failing businesses. And if you have worked in a business 30, 40 years, you're selling refrigerators or school uniforms, whatever it is something that you know. You build relationships with other people, customers. But I was talking to one owner who was a market trader, and as you know, indoor markets are on their way out. But this was somebody who'd been working there for a long time, and the business was no longer making any money. She reached a point where she realised she was going to have to dip into her savings to keep the business going. And I said, well, why didn't you pull out a couple of years ago? And her reply was, well, you get into a rut. You know, you go in at a certain time every day, you sell your stuff, you order your goods, you go home at a certain time, it's what you know. And she said it's very hard to imagine doing anything else. And again, it's that psychological shelter. Being in a rut is actually often quite a nice place to be. But the trouble is, it can come at a price. If you're in that rut and you're taking money out of your pension funds to keep the business going, you're going to pay badly for it in the end. But we do it. We all do it. And had she addressed the problem sooner, had she been willing to confront it, of course the losses would have been a lot less. Omission. Do no harm. There's a little needle there because one of the big controversies you've all read in the newspapers about vaccinations. Now, let's take a situation where there's a certain vaccination for a potentially life-threatening disease, and we know from research that the vaccine kills 5 people in 10,000. But the disease kills 10 people in 10,000. Which is the sensible option? Which is the sensible, logical option? It's the vaccine, isn't it? But how many of you say, no, we're not taking that risk? And again, there's a certain psychology at work here, which is that we worry more about mistakes of what we call commission, about doing something that proves to be a mistake, than not doing something that proves to be an even bigger mistake. So we weigh things a bit unevenly. The attraction is we feel we're doing no harm. We may get away with it, but we are actually taking an unnecessary risk. To give you a more light-hearted example, the National Lottery. Do you remember a few months, a year or two ago was it, they put the price up from £1 to £2. And what they did was, this was ethically admirable. Everybody who played online, they wrote to them and said, unless you re-register with us, you'll stop playing. Which was ethically superb. But of course, what happens? They lose a lot of business. If people had had to make an active decision to leave the lottery, would they? Just imagine the situation. You've got your 6 numbers, right, and it's Thursday, and you decide, right, I'm not playing the lottery anymore, it's too expensive, it's gone from £1 to £2, right, that's it. And then on Saturday, your 6 numbers come up. Oh, disaster. And again, it's because you think, oh, I might regret this, I might regret pulling out of this, that you let it go. And it's a form of omission. Sometimes we simply cannot decide. We delay the choice. And we tend to do that when the decision is often really difficult. And when all options are pretty dire, when things are bad, we may often just delay the choice. Or we may try and find a way out that involves no action, no change at all. And you see it in firms. Instead of making a decision, they go and demand more and more information. You may go and look up this on the internet and that product on the internet, whatever. But what you're really doing is postponing what is potentially a painful decision. Or buck passing, you make the decision. Any of you done that? You make the decision. And it's a form of avoidance, particularly when all options are rather grim. Now, a related problem is what we call the status quo bias. It's preference for what we've already got, what we have, over an uncertain future. One manifestation of it is that we tend to overvalue what we have, and we tend to retreat into comfort zones. Now, just a little brain teaser here. On eBay, what percentage of items do you think that are advertised on eBay sell? Anyone want to guess? That's a very good guess, whoever that was. Thank you. Thank you. Apparently, just to turn that round, at least 30%, about a third of items on eBay don't sell. And the reason they don't sell is that the owners of the goods and chattels ask too much for them because they are overvaluing what they already have. You see it with houses. How many times you open the local paper? How much? And sometimes it's estate agents enthusiastically driving up prices, flattering owners to get the business. But quite often it's the owners themselves, you know. I've got a, whatever it is, a little shed, you know, and I'm not taking less than 3 million for it. I exaggerate for effect, but it's that kind of behaviour. But 6 months later, they're wondering why it hasn't sold. And the opportunity to realise the asset, the liquidity, whatever, of course, has passed them by. Similarly, it's thought that that's one reason why the American steel industry went to the wall and lost out very badly to Japan. That because the industrialists in the 1950s and 60s understood their technology and they liked it and they were comfortable with it. But they didn't want to get involved in this newfangled method that the Japanese were using. And over time, they just quietly lost out. But retreated for the short term into their comfort zones. And that's the basic dilemma. It's the comfort of today. It's avoiding those painful decisions we might have to make for the bigger price tomorrow. The decision may get made in the end, but often it's just at greater cost. Here's a nice problem to have. What would you prefer? 500,000 for sure? Take it away with you this afternoon? Or a 50% chance to win 1 million or nothing at all? Aha. Now just think what that means. If funds permitted, I mean, I sometimes do this with undergraduates who are a bit hard up, and £20 here and 40 for a spin of a coin. Scale it down a little bit. But just imagine you opted for number 2. Just imagine the flick of the coin. You've got a 50% chance of going away with 1 million. But that's not what you're thinking about, is it? No, what you're thinking about is the 50% chance of going home with nothing at all, when you could have been going with 500,000. Regret. And you're probably thinking, well, you know, 500,000, I could pay off the mortgage, buy a new car, go on holiday, which is fine. But let's look at another dilemma. Supposing the problem's framed this way. You can have 500 for sure, we'll go round and bring round the bag, the sack, 500,000, or a 90% chance for 1 million. Now what? Now what? I only wish I could go around this lecture theatre to every one of you and say, all right, what are you going to do? Let's have a little show of hands here. 500 for sure? Who's going to take a punt? 90% chance. You think about it. 9 out of 10. And just as another matter of interest, who would play Russian roulette for 100 million? Who would play it? Now, I do this with students. We put the numbers in a hat and we go around and they draw them out, that 1 in 6 chance. And the atmosphere in the room gets increasingly tense because sooner or later, bang. Sometimes we just can't accept we've got a problem. We tell ourselves it's not broken. And sometimes that's an alarm clock going off. It takes a severe shock to force decision makers to recognise reality. You know, we call it the wake-up call. We just cannot accept things are going wrong. And again, I take the example of a market trader. He'd sold off businesses that were losing money. He kept one. And he just never went near the place. He appointed staff. He just closed his eyes to reality, and then one day he got a bank statement. Oh, horrors. Deep in the red. And that was a kind of wake-up call, because he finally started working in the shop, made some staff redundant, pulled it back into a modest kind of profit. But again, it was a problem of his own creation. He'd let it go that far. And we just do it. We do it. We sometimes just cannot accept that we need to act to intervene in a problem. Well, what can we do to avoid costly inaction, but without falling into the opposite trap of recklessness? What can we do? Now, you hear the song, don't you? Act now, tomorrow may never come. What should we do when we've got too much information? And what should we do when the options are all pretty dire? And when is it really wise to do nothing at all? Let's have a look at some of those questions. The first thing I would say is think ahead. The future, particularly if it's bad, generally does have a habit of arriving, doesn't it? The first piece of advice I give you is don't agree to something just because it's distant. Let me take a typical thing. You get an invitation to attend a conference in Edinburgh in 9 months' time. Or you're invited to a wedding of somebody you can't really stand the sight of, and you hate the family and everything else, and it's a long way away, it's in Lisbon, and it's in 9 months' time. The temptation often is to agree to something just because it's in 9 months' time, isn't it? And it's a kind of discounting the future. Oh, it'll be all right on the night, sort of thing. Well, if you hate the idea now, what's going to change in the next 9 months? And sometimes what happens is we are simply afraid to say, what's that little word? Comes in useful? No. No, thank you. Now, it would be best if we didn't have these problems in the first place. The best time to fix problems is when they don't actually exist, or when they are very, very small. I've called it the ghost of Christmas future. But a lot of issues can be tackled sooner rather than later. Now, you may think, how? Well, just take a very, very simple thing. If you've got, say, a child and a cot and things in a dangerous position, you can see the potential for an accident. So, as a responsible parent or grandparent, what do? You rearrange all the furniture so that accident can't happen. It's the same thing. Take the business example. You don't invest every last penny in the single business, so you've got all your eggs in one basket. You fix that problem, you don't allow it to develop because you develop multiple business interests, or you put money in a pension pot. You stop that problem from arriving. If you don't, it will. An interesting example, you heard maybe recently on the news Goldman Sachs are saying about Britain leaving the EC, Europe, and they are a very influential voice, are they not? Whether you like them or don't, they are an influential voice. Why are they heard often above other respected firms? Well, there's a kind of mystique and magic about the firm. But it might not be in existence today, except for a couple of partners in the early 1990s decided that they were astoundingly prosperous at that time, the firm. Huge bull market, really, really making money hand over fist. And the partners decided that this party was not going to last a lot longer, and that they needed to branch out and get into new areas of business in order to secure the future. Now, it wasn't easy convincing other partners. It never is when the problem doesn't exist. It's only usually when it's a crisis that people pay attention. But Goldman successfully managed to get the firm to redirect well in advance of market changes actually developing. So they had a competitive lead. And as you can see, it has stood them in good stead. Let's look at procrastination. I would suggest to you that of all the biases I've talked about, this one is the biggest obstacle to success. This is what really stops what might have been. But there are ways around it. There are ways of dealing with procrastination. The first thing to do is to specify exactly what would success look like. Now, if my ambition is that my teaching and research is going to change the way the Western world thinks, forget it. It's not going to happen. And if it did, we wouldn't recognise it. Best way out of procrastination is to have some very, very specific ideas. Now, it can be very simple. Hold a dinner party. Have a nice dinner party together. It can be get shortlisted for a job. Get the job. Whatever it is, specifying exactly what success would look like. Again, those of you who've got families, it's not easy being a parent. That's why I'm not a parent, because I know that, because I wouldn't have liked to have brought me up. But you can go, oh, my son's this and my daughter's that, and oh, it's just all a waste of children, the more trouble than they're worth. Hang on. What would a good child look like? What would it do? What would it behave? How would it behave? And that's pinning it down to specifics. Oh, well, come and see me once a month. Right. Let's quantify that. Phone once or twice a week. What you're doing then is pinning down a big issue into something that you can actually address. But we tend not to do that, and that's why we never get any closer to our goals, because we never really define them in ways that we can achieve. Okay, we've got an idea of what success would look like. Here's the difficult question. What needs to be done now? Not later, not in a year's time, not when we feel like doing it, but what needs to be done right now. Well, if you want somebody to start phoning you, the best thing is to go and phone them, isn't it? And they might start to reciprocate. So what needs to be done now? You need to get on the phone, or write that letter, or make that gesture, apply for that job, enroll for that training course, get out to that social group on a Wednesday, phone up, find out the details. But the problem we have is that often what we want to do, or rather what we need to do, is the very opposite of what we want to do. Take a very simple example. You've decided that your goal after Christmas is to lose 1 stone. What do you need to do now? You need to eat less. Simple as that. What would you like to do? Have a biscuit. If you are really good, the best thing to do is the hardest part of the job first. I remember reading, I don't know if you've read it, Tony Blair's autobiography. It's quite a pleasant read. But one of the interesting things in it is that he says he started on the hardest chapters first. Now that was a very willful, and I don't mean that in a bad way, a very willful strategy. And it made the writing of the book in the end a lot easier and faster, because psychologists believe that our motivation increases as we get nearer the goal. So if you've done the hard bit first, you're going to be racing up to the finishing post. And also, if you've done the hard bit, your confidence, your sense of self-power, self-efficacy is boosted, so you approach the rest with a lot more brio, confidence, we'll get it done, optimism. But it comes from addressing the bits that you most don't want to do. But there is one question I suggest you ask yourself. I'll just go back a minute, if I may. If what you need to do is the opposite of what you want to do, why is that? There's a famous law firm in America called Watchels. I forget the rest of the name of the partnership, but it's in the lecture transcript. And they started off in the mid-1960s. And this was a bunch of lawyers who couldn't get a job anywhere in mainstream law in corporate America. So they thought, right, we'll start our own firm. And we'll do what we want to do. We will go in search of an interesting life. We will not become a conventional law firm doing all the forms and the paperwork. We will be a specialist firm of last resort. And they were incredibly successful. But ultimately, why? Because the partners went in search, not so much of a lucrative life, but an interesting life. Now, if there is something that you want to do, and you don't want to do it, well, stop. This is telling you something. And just by the way, there is a difference between saying, I want to be, and I want to do. I want to be a writer. I want to be a ballerina. There's an awful big difference between saying, I want to write, and I want to dance. Because if you want to dance, you will be all over. I'm not going to try dancing, but just a little bit of liveliness. You will be all over the place. If you want to write, you'll be scribbling on the back of sugar packets. But if you want to be a writer, you probably dream of a cottage in the country. And what you really want are the trappings of writing with none of the slog and loneliness. It's not going to work. And if you can recognise that, it means you can correct yourself from a potentially futile and miserable path. Just coming back to doing what we need to do. A couple of proverbs. Always do what you're afraid to do, or screw it, let's do it. It is often fear that holds us back. If it's that telephone call to that estranged child or friend or parent, it's that making the first move, it's that fear of rejection, isn't it? That's what's holding you back. Come on, you've got time to make the phone call. Of course you have. We all have. You're not applying for the job because you're frightened of being rejected. Yet the strange thing is that if you sit down and do that application or make that call, at least half of that fear will probably vanish. But it is that fear of failure that holds us back. Here's another approach. Instead of, did you all write out resolutions in the new year? Yeah. Yeah, and how many of you are still adhering to them? Right. How many of you think about wish lists? Some of you do. Maybe, what I would wish, what I would like to happen. Yeah, okay, fine. Tear up the wish list. Write out a do it now list. It works if you do it. It works. Because that tiny step is going to make a difference. What is it, the Chinese proverb? The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a first step. And it is often that first step. And if we can do the first step, the second step's a bit easier, and the third, and the fourth. But it is just getting started. And again, it's a kind of discount in the future. You know, you hate doing something, you don't want to do it. And while you're standing there ranting and raving about the problem, you might as well have sat down and had a go. And nothing's getting any better anyway. Here's a little cheer. Some things are not worth putting the effort into. Now, when you were at school, you were often told, if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing well, and to do everything you do nicely, neatly, good, better, best, and all that. Make the effort. It's a recipe for burnout if you keep doing it. Some things you have to do, but you don't have to do them that well. The important thing is you just do them. So it may be that you are the secretary of the local club and you've got to write up the minutes. Well, you don't need to turn out stuff equivalent to Shakespeare's sonnets, do you? You just do what you have to do. Nobody reads them. So it's not worth investing all that effort into. But again, it makes the whole thing just that little bit less daunting. For sustained success, Tom Peters, make a list of the things you hate doing and stop doing them. Why? Now, even just making a list of the things you hate doing will tell you something about what direction you're taking. And then, if you can't stop all of them, but look and think, well, you're in a job. You could be retired. You hate getting up on a winter's morning. Well, isn't it time to think of a change of direction then? Tasks at work, things you hate doing, could you delegate them? Is there someone else that you could trust to do it? But that is the main thing. We'll just stop doing. Ultimate success. T.S. Eliot. I think the whole line was something like, teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to stand still. Sometimes this is bringing us into the realms of not doing when it's as well. The thing is, what's worrying us is loss, not succeeding. The strongest way of approaching is to care and yet not care about the outcome. I'm applying for 3 jobs. I'm applying for them. Right. If I get shortlisted, if I get it's nice. And if I don't care. Anybody in the room in love? There's no need to put your hand up. Lovelorn, unrequited love. It's the caring. The worst thing you can do in a romantic relationship is tell the other party just how you feel. Completely boring. We'll come back to that if we have a little time at the end, as it's nearly Valentine's Day. Well, how do we remedy omission? First of all, look at what inaction is costing you. If it's not costing you anything, don't worry about it. If there's nothing spoiling, as they say in Yorkshire, don't worry about it. Consider, though, doing what you never expected to do. Opportunities that come along. We never know who's come along to influence in our lives. You today, if you were to look back 30, 20, 30, 40, 10 years, however many years ago, and think, how did I get here? Where did I expect to be? It'll be nothing like what you expected. And the moral there is, don't be afraid to let unexpected events play themselves out, to Follow that winding stair. There's a pathway to all success. You just never know where something might lead. Is the decision really that important? Now, I put the donkey there because there's a sad story here. And it was a donkey. And it had 2 bags of hay. 1 bag here, 1 bag there. And they were identical bags of hay. It just couldn't decide which bag to eat. And the poor old donkey starved because it couldn't decide. And a lot of decisions are not really that important. You may agonise over a mobile phone. Which mobile phone shall I get? Well, they all work. And they're all useless. And they're all expensive. Just grab one. But a lot of decisions are not that important. It's all going to be the same in the end. And those are the ones not to spend much mental energy on. That's the real point. Shortcuts. If you are agonising between A and B, because most decisions come down, if it's a car, most decisions come down to A or B. We can usually get rid of the peripheral options. Well, if you'd be roughly happy with both, flip a coin. Heads or tails. Now, if you are secretly hoping that the coin's going to come down heads or tails, there's your decision. You don't need to flip it. You know what you want, actually. Another one is just give me one good reason to do this. One good reason to buy the Audi, one good reason to buy the Jaguar, one good reason to buy the Vauxhall. And if you can't think of a good reason to do it, don't do it. And then look at your good reasons and which are the most important to you. If things are really dire, and no option is very good, you've been made redundant, there's not much prospect of getting another job, do you sell, you just keep it. Go for the least worst. If you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, go for the least worst. There's nothing else you can do. Just sit down, analyse the two, the advantages, disadvantages, the costs, the prospects. Take the least worst. Be guided by probability. That's another thing. For example, if you've got 3 jobs to apply for, 2 are external, 1 it's an internal job only advertised in your firm, then yeah, you've obviously got most chance of getting the 3rd one because there's not going to be as many applicants because it's advertised internally. That's the one to put your effort and energy into. Or those of you who are familiar with tarot cards know that number 6 is the card of the knight surrounded by the 2 lovers, both tugging at the knight's sleeve. And what does the knight do? Instead of choosing between A and B, gets in his chariot and runs off. Not very chivalrous, but quite sensible. It's just simply rejecting choice. No, I'm not going to have any of them. It's something that you can do. Coming to the job one, a practical application of rejecting choices. Who says you've only got time to apply for 1 job? If it's that important, why not take a week off work and put 3 good applications in? Again, it's a form of rejecting what you thought was a choice between A or B or C. Take them all, if it's that important. Remedies for status quo by action this day. Churchill was famous for that. Do it now is another way of saying it. We're all good. Now, there are some things we wish we had done. Maybe if we're reconciled to somebody in a relationship, maybe we now wish we'd done it 20 years ago. If we've done something like maybe adopted a child or something, we wish we'd now done it years ago. Okay, fine. You can't change that. past is gone. But if the best time to do anything was 20 years ago, the next best time is often now. Very rarely is it completely too late, so that we can actually action something. Look for subtle signs of change. One leaf falling should tell you that it's autumn. Don't wait until you've got a battery of evidence that something isn't working. Some pieces of evidence may be small, but in themselves are extremely telling. In the case of the market traders I mentioned earlier, the day one stall fell vacant and unlet was the day the market was going down. Because who is going to pay £100,000 to buy a stall, buy a business, if they can set one up for nothing? That was a small, seemingly insignificant sign, but actually contained an enormous amount of information. Just like the falling leaf. Be careful you don't value too much. We've been through that, so I won't spend any time on it. Some decisions don't need to be made in a hurry, actually. Time brings clarity. It allows emotions to cool. It gets things in proportion. Now, there's a very important psychology here. Have you ever been out shopping, whether it's for a pair of boots, a jumper, anything, and it becomes an obsession, an absolute obsession. It's the most important thing in the world. And there's a psychological reason for that, and that is if we zoom down on something, it assumes an importance, it just grows out of proportion. And the best thing to do is just to retreat from the situation, let it get back in proportion. Otherwise, there is a danger. It's called end the pain. The psychologists recognise that sometimes you buy the hat or the pair of shoes or the just to get out the place, just to make a decision, just to end the uncertainty. No, you don't need to do that. The other thing is that time does change things. Time changes everything. And that potentially is a lecture in itself. But for practical purposes, it is just worth thinking that time often allows one party to get stronger, the other to weaken. If you're buying a car, the deal that you get offered at the beginning of the month is one thing. But if you wait till nearer the end, if they're a few short of target, you will be able to bargain your way into a much better deal, because they are then under pressure to make up the target. And so they may be willing to sell at cost or even a small loss to get a bonus. And all that's changed there is time, letting time do its work. Incidentally, persuasion is a matter of time. If you're trying to persuade anybody, you need to break off. You need to give them time to take in your arguments, to get used to your point of view. You cannot deal with it with a barrage of argument. You've got to give the other party time to think. Or as we say, plant an idea, let it grow, water it occasionally. And quite often, time will bring forth things. What was impossible at time one just becomes easy at time two. And it's always worth remembering that success happens because certain things come together. Success is not a matter of luck. It's not a matter of Mars being in conjunction with Jupiter. It is a matter of 2 or 3, 4, 5 important things all coming together. And the fewer things you need to come together, the more successful you're likely to be. But again, it's giving them time for all those things to align themselves and making not just the right decision, but the right decision at the right time. Patience obtaineth all things. Time unlocks every door. That doesn't necessarily mean taking forever, incidentally. It just means that things are not a matter of time. And in poker, they do say money flows from the impatient to the patient. Now, there is a difference between taking your time and being too slow. But patience does often bring particular rewards. And patience is the ultimate in doing nothing, isn't it? Spring comes, grass grows by itself. You don't have to do anything. Above all, don't react to everything that seems to demand a reaction. Remember that choosing not to do something can be every bit as significant in your fate as the things you do. And don't worry about retreating from a situation where you can't win, where it's not the right time. Even that is a kind of strategy. It contains a kind of nugget of aggression. A retreating army can be a fighting army. But supposing you've done all that and you've made your decision and it's not working out. You may say, that's the last time I come to a Gresham lecture. I regret it. Hopefully not. But if you'll have me back, what I want to talk about next is what we do when we're faced with decisions that are not working out, and why, as human beings, we sometimes perpetuate them instead of ditching them, and what we can do to protect ourselves. And also how doing nothing, the passage of time, can sometimes lock us in unexpected ways. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take questions.